Welcome to this video presentation of the paper Learning Outcomes, Changing Education, Traces of Policy in Practice. The paper is developed for the virtual CIES 2020 by myself, Tine Sofie Preutz, and Kristine Mølstad, Alessandra Diodé, and Camilla Vik. We are all colleagues in the research project Tracing Learning Outcomes in Policy and Practice, funded by the Norwegian Research Council. The background for the research project is anchored in studies of education reform. And studies of education reform have, over a longer period, focused on structural change, recurring thematic in education reform, and how varied models of education reform have failed to make change. We also see a growing research corpus that offer various understandings of how policy might affect teachers, school leaders, and administrators through systems and procedures supplied by policy, and also how teachers realize and frame education policies in classrooms through their individual practices. However, the literature seems to have fewer studies zooming in on the relations between the intentions of reform and educational change, and the understandings of reform in municipalities and schools, and the potential activities and practices of reform across education system levels. Our study are anchored in the Norwegian context, where recent reforms have emphasized learning outcomes, and a stronger learning outcomes orientation have been introduced. Education policy developments globally reflect a widespread expansion of learning outcomes orientation in policy and in curriculum and assessment. And the literature shows how this has led to changes in perceptions of ideology and quality, and switching the focus from input indicators to outcome indicators. More recently, we have seen the learning outcomes orientation spreading to the Nordic countries, challenging a long-standing didactic and licensing tradition in education. Recent research has shown how learning outcomes has a central role in the reorganization of education systems by decentralizing education policy and reallocating executive power and responsibility from the state to local actors, such as municipalities, school leaders, and teachers. The literature also emphasizes how learning outcomes have been a powerful instrument in the reorganization of education management, and critics have claimed them to be more so than being a tool for strengthening teaching and learning. The paper that we are presenting take a discussion approach to a selection of empirical studies, guided by the overarching research question of what happens in policy, in schools, and in classrooms with the introduction of learning outcomes, and the following sub-questions of what traces of policy in practice can be observed, and has the introduction of learning outcomes led to changes in education. The context of the study is a 14-year period of education reform in Norway, and the ideational, material, and operational engagements of actors working with learning outcomes in policy, in schools, and in classrooms. The study aims to trace the relationships between the macro policy of the formal system and the microactivities of the lived organization of administrators, school leaders, and teachers, as it is known to be difficult to study the relationship between policy and practice, because policy messages are often transformed and adapted and seldom being stable across education levels. We have chosen to zoom in on the instruments, tools, and techniques of the involved actors and how they engage with these and how these are inscribed in practice. We do this by employing a multi-directional approach where we combine empirical data collected at policy level, school level, and classroom level. And in this paper, we draw on document data, interview data, and video data from the three levels by the three selected empirical examples. In the following, I will present the three examples, first by looking at the policy level, and second by looking at the school level, and finally the third level of classroom. In the example 1, the policy level, we focus on the definitions and the ideational engagements of the reform period by studying policy use of concepts in key policy documents, such as commissioned reports, white papers, green papers, the Educational Act, national budget, and national curriculum and guidelines. By the help of word counts, we get an overview of high-frequency policy defining concepts that really stands out, as you can see in the presented diagram. Here we can see that policy is oriented towards general concepts such as competence, goal, development, knowledge, learning, and support. And these 6 concepts have we identify as high-frequency policy defining concepts. In a second phase of in-depth content analysis, reading what these 6 high-frequency policy defining concepts are about, we discovered that these concepts primarily are used about one actor group, the teacher. And this we find to be in contrast to the first years of the reform that primarily focused on school leaders as the key change agent. When we look at the text of the documents related to these 6 policy defining concepts, it is about teacher competence. It is about goals that teachers should work towards, or goals for teacher development, and teacher knowledge and various types of teacher knowledge. When it comes to learning, it is actually more about teachers learning and learning processes and support for learning than students learning. So in general, throughout this document study, we find that policy is grounded in ideas and expectations of alignment between nationally predefined goals for learning, the teaching activities, and student learning and results, which is not a surprise, as these are the basics of a learning outcomes orientation in education. More surprisingly, we find that teachers are, as interpreters of policy, are placed as key actors in the realization of this policy, where we see policy striving to balance measures of governing and degrees of professional autonomy. We also see that there is a strong belief in the alignment between teacher competence and student learning, and also students' future life. When in example 2, the school level, we'll look closer at material engagements. And one general finding is how assessment has gained a central position in schools. We see it as a rhetorical and argumentative element in school, in teachers' interpretation of curricula, and in planning, in teaching practices, and in understandings of what learning is, when learning occurs, and how learning can be observed, confirmed, and documented. In the interviews, teachers report to have changed their practice of curriculum planning and practice over the years of the reform. They say that now planning starts from the predefined learning outcomes in the national curriculum, and that these goals are used directly in classroom teaching, but also as interpreted and broken down intermediate goals in so-called goal sheets to support students' work. I have put in a couple of quotations from the interview transcripts just to illustrate what we have seen. And these quotations are rather typical for the material. One teacher says, "I like to establish consciousness concerning the curriculum goals in class. What is this topic? Which part of the curriculum is it we are working on? So I extract the goals from the national curriculum and I highlight the verbs and the theory. And there's a conversation about what this implies." And here we put in "with the students" in brackets to illustrate that teachers actually discuss the learning outcomes from the national curriculum in class when teaching the students about what they say and the meaning and also their elements, what they consist of. Further, another teacher says, before we started with the book and we got through the book, while now it is straight to the competence goals. And the competence goals is a Norwegian term used for the learning outcomes in the national curriculum. What is it that the competence goals state? This is what we're going to address this year, or this is what the pupils shall be able to. And then our work is targeted towards that. We skip the parts in the book that are not part of the competence goals. Here we see that the teacher kind of delimits his or her actions towards the students according to the learning outcomes in the national curriculum. In the example 3, we take a closer look at the classroom activities and what we've called operational engagement. And in classrooms, we see a particular way of teaching of and learning as process, structured in a certain way, framed by learning outcomes in several steps. The first step is introduction of thematic framed by learning outcomes, an assignment made by the teacher, assessment, and criteria. Teachers don't use much time on the introduction. We do not see the classic lectures, but we do see that teachers start students according to a thematic, aiming for a certain assignment. We see a first round of student work with the assignment and the first round of hand-in of assignment to the teacher. The teacher gives formative feedback, and we have a second round of student work with the assignment and a second round of hand-in of assignment to the teacher, and the final summative assessment and feedback. And in this lower secondary school, they also get a grade for their building towards the final diploma. Across these steps, we also see a high degree of group work initiated by teachers. Students sit together and work with assignments most of the time, and this can be considered as a new development compared to earlier research on classroom studies in Norway. So we see that students seldom sit alone. There is a substantial amount of group work, and teachers very often provide arenas for interaction, dialogue, and situation for learning together. We also see that because of these steps, we see a high degree of complexity and integration, potentially blurring lines between teaching and assessment. So, returning to the initial question of what happens in policy, in schools and in classrooms with the introduction of learning outcomes. In the Norwegian setting, the introduction of learning outcomes during the last 14 years of intensive education reform seem to have established ground for several changes in education. First of all, we see an explicit and general change in orientation towards goals and assessment in policy in schools and in classrooms. In policy, teachers are forefronted as key agents of change and as qualified, competent, and responsible professionals considered essential for students' learning and students' future life. In schools, professionals have adapted and changed their way of working, guided by the national curriculum and the predefined goals, but also by professionally developed practices towards assignment-oriented teaching, framed by self-made criteria and assessment. In classrooms, teachers and students engage in highly dialogic interactional learning process where learning together seem to be emphasized. And we also see this complexity and integrated ways of working with assignments. The study shows how key policy documents such as the national curriculum seem to have a strong impact on classroom practices, either directly in discussions and negotiation about their meaning with students in classrooms or indirectly to teachers' interpretation in goal sheets. The study illustrates how teachers employ newer forms of teaching and assessment that emphasize process, dialogue, and interaction in line with theories on learning outcomes for teaching and learning. We see integrate and complex ways of teaching challenging traditional distinctions between teaching and assessment in both policy and practice. And we see teachers building on older principles of practice adapted and developed to newer trends and policies. The study can be seen as an example of how policy and practice are arenas for the co-construction of public education, and that researching education reform seems to require a multidirectional approach that includes both policy and practice. And by these words, I'm ending this video presentation. So, thank you for the attention. If you have any questions and comments, please do not hesitate to make contact. Thank you.